The gold of the temple reflected the morning light. The priests sang, the people bowed, and at the center of the splendor stood he, Solomon, the promised son, the man to whom God gave wisdom like never before. Solomon was surrounded by gold, incense, and reverence. The newly consecrated temple shone under the gaze of a people singing praises to the God of Israel. The king's wisdom had spread like the wind among the nations, and kings from distant lands came not to bow before the sword, but before the counsel of his voice. They said the Lord had given him a wise and understanding heart, like no man had ever received. His name was synonymous with justice, and his words were sought after like the very gold that adorned the pillars of the sanctuary. But the same heart that discerned the secrets of the people began to lean toward the secrets of women. First came Pharaoh's daughter, then the Moabites, Ammonites, Sidonians, and Hittites. Solomon was no longer satisfied with wisdom. He now sought the allure of the exotic, the gleam in foreign eyes, the touch of skin that knew not the God of his fathers. Wisdom, once a sacred gift, became an instrument of seduction and power. He denied no desire, and with each new wife, a new altar was raised, and with each new altar, the king's heart drifted one step further from the Holy of Holies.
If you love my heart, do not reject the God who formed it.
To love you is to accept. You may build an altar for your God.
And so the wisest man on earth began to dig, with his own hands, the abyss in which he would bury his throne. Solomon ascended the throne of his father David, while still young, with eyes full of fear and a heart weighed down by the burden of rule. The tribes were unified, but external and internal threats still whispered within the walls of Jerusalem. On that first night as king, he withdrew to Gibeon. There, amidst sincere sacrifices, the heavens opened, and in a dream, God spoke to him.
Solomon, son of David, tell me what you desire.
And Solomon, with a pure heart, replied,
I seek not victories, nor riches, nor long days. I want wisdom to govern your people.
And the Most High was pleased with what the young man had asked, and granted him a wise heart, along with what he had not asked for. Quickly his fame spread beyond the walls of Jerusalem. In his early days, 2 women came before the throne, each claiming to be the mother of the same baby. Solomon listened in silence. Then he asked for a sword.
Cut the child in half. Let each woman have a part.
All were in shock. One of the women fell to her knees and crying pleaded,
No, let her have him. Just don't kill him.
And then the king raised his hand.
Give her the child, she's the mother.
And all the people marveled, for they saw that the presence of God has dwelled in that man's judgment. With the throne stabilized and his heart still turned to the Lord, Solomon began to fulfill the greatest dream of his father, the building of a house for the God of Israel. He gathered the finest craftsmen, sought cedar wood from Lebanon, hand-carved stones, gold from Ophir, and the most precious adornments. For 7 years, thousands of men worked day and night. At the end of that time, the Temple of Jerusalem rose, majestic, with bronze pillars, linen curtains, and the Holy of Holies covered in glory. When the king entered with the priests and bowed before the altar, he stretched out his hands and prayed before the entire congregation.
Can God dwell among men? Not even the highest heavens can contain you, much less this house.
And that day fire came down from heaven, the glory filled the sanctuary, and all Israel bowed with their faces to the ground. in awe and praise. An old priest, voice trembling, turned to a young scribe and murmured,
"If this king guards his heart, Israel will never know exile."
But that statement would not last long, for not even the temple's gold could guard a spirit that one day would begin to give in. And among the columns of the house of God, where once only praise was heard, another kind of silence was being born. A thin, distant, almost imperceptible silence, like the first thread of a crack in a throne still intact. The peace established on the throne was followed by treaties, agreements, and alliances that expanded Israel's influence like never before. And as was the custom among kings, each sealed treaty brought a woman with it. The first was Pharaoh's daughter. Then came the Moabites, Sidonians, Edomites, Ammonites, and Hittites. They arrived in perfumed caravans, with eyes dark like aged wine and garments that flowed like rivers over skin. Solomon welcomed them with gifts, built them palaces, and listened closely to their songs, their legends, and the names of their gods whispered in strange tongues, like enchantments. The princes and Levites watched in silence. The prophets saw but still hesitated to speak. The people, captivated by the king's glory, did not see that the first crack had become a fissure. The women demanded nothing. It was enough to be loved. And out of love, Solomon yielded. First in the palace courts, then on the hills near Jerusalem, small altars began to appear. One for Ashtoreth, another for Moloch, others for Chemosh and Milcom. New incense rose, new perfumes hovered in the air, and the king, once devout, now wandered among sheets and columns of smoke. His wisdom, once pure, became a folded blade. Now it was used to justify his choices.
Peace requires understanding. Love deserves room. Not every altar is a betrayal.
And the same lips that had consecrated the temple now defended spiritual diversity. In nightly banquets between wine and flesh, the songs no longer invoked only the name of the Lord. The names of Baal, Ishtar, and Remphan were heard as well. And Solomon's gaze, once fixed on the Holy of Holies, now drifted into the shine of gold and the touch of hands that did not know Yahweh. One day a man in linen entered the upper court of the palace, a nameless prophet, unshaven, and with eyes full of pain. He approached the king and with a firm voice said,
"Solomon, your name echoes like justice, but your incense speaks another tongue. Who will hear your prayers when the heavens are veiled by other names?"
There was silence in the hall. All awaited the king's fury, but Solomon only turned his gaze and replied with a slowness that was not doubt, but resignation.
Peace requires concessions, and the world demands politics.
700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,000 ways to love, to rule, to yield, 1,000 voices surrounding him at dawn, shaping the king with kisses, oaths, and promises of eternal kingdoms. The king who once heard the voice of God now lay on soft cushions, listening to the gods of the nations.
Raise an altar, Solomon. Not for the people, just for me. If you love me, honor what is sacred to me too.
And he yielded. One altar for love, one temple for devotion, one sacrifice for pleasure. The hills around Jerusalem became sensual gardens of idolatry. Priestesses danced among torches. The incense's perfume mingled with the scent of bodies and the warmth of the night. And while the chants rose, the angels fell silent. The temple still stood at the city's center, but its centrality was only geographical. And while the people celebrated prosperity, heaven no longer answered. 700 wives, 700 alliances, 700 breaches. The crowd saw an empire of glory, but heaven saw a throne surrendered to the flesh. And there was one woman among so many who possessed him like no other, a Sidonian, priestess of Ashtoreth, with eyes like blades and hands that could guide a king without a word.
Solomon, your love is great, But your God is small, the world has other names, for what is also divine.
And he, overcome by desire and reasoning, is replied,
Perhaps heaven is greater than we think. Perhaps your God also has a place among ours.
The next night, Solomon went up with her to the hill bordering Jerusalem. There he ordered an altar to be built, not for the Lord, for her goddess. The statue was set, the garments were changed, the chants were sung, and that night, the hill that once witnessed sacrifices of justice now glowed with the name of Ashtoreth. The stones of the temple did not move, the walls of Jerusalem did not fall, but the king's heart was no longer one, and the silence of God, once a presence, was now absence. The king walked alone and through the corridors of his cedar house. The walls were covered with fine tapestries, but the air was heavy. His eyes, once alive, had turned dull. His steps were dragged. Old age had come not only with years, but with the weight of multiplied desires. The women still surrounded him, now not as passion but as demand. Rituals, sacrifices, feasts. The altars never stopped rising. The holy city had become a hill encircled by other names, other temples, other voices, and in the midst of it all, the king remained silent. The people murmured. The servants complained about the taxes, which increased to sustain the palaces, the foreign priests, the endless celebrations. Gold no longer flowed as before. The scribes wrote with less zeal. The name of Solomon, once synonymous with glory, was now whispered with doubt. Some said he had strayed, others that he had gone mad, but those who saw him closely knew he was no longer a king. He was a man surrounded by empty thrones. It was in that time that the Lord spoke, not in a vision, not in a dream, but in judgment. The word came like a sword, cutting everything around.
Because your heart has turned away and followed other gods, I will tear your kingdom away. But for the sake of David, your father, I will not do it in your days. Your son will reap what you have sown.
And then heaven fell, silent again. Solomon tried to pray. He went up to the temple, wore his royal garments, bowed before the altar, but his lips found no words. The priests sang psalms, but his ears heard them as if from afar. He lifted his arms, but felt only the weight of emptiness. He tried to remember when God used to speak to him, but the memories were distant, blurred, like echoes of a youth lost in silks and incense. That night, he left the palace without escort. He crossed the city through shadows, covered in a simple cloak. He climbed a northern hill, not one of the sanctified, but one of the profaned. He stopped before an altar of black stones. The torches still burned, the priestesses still danced. A sacrifice had just ended. The smell of blood still hung in the air. And there, motionless, Solomon watched as a woman poured wine and ashes over a statue of Moloch. His eyes were wide open, but his soul absent. The temple was full, but God no longer dwelled there. Solomon descended the hill before dawn, his feet dragged like those of an exile. And though no one saw him, that morning the most glorious king of Israel returned home as a man who had lost everything, including himself. The next morning the servants noticed something different. The king no longer came out for judgments. His voice was no longer heard in the halls. He shut himself away with scrolls and ink, trying to write. But the words no longer flowed as before. The sentences came out bitter, heavy, broken. The proverbs that once built up now sounded like questions without answers.
I saw all that is done under the sun, and all is vanity.
Solomon walked through the gardens of his youth, but no longer recognized the trees. He paused before faces he once loved, but found no comfort in them. And then, on a silent night, he returned to the hill where it had all begun. Not to the temple, but to the mount where Ashtoreth had once been exalted. There was no more dancing, no song, only ashes. He sat there, his hands trembled, the wind struck his robes, and for the first time in a long time he spoke to himself audibly.
I became king of kings and servant of idols. I saw the world at my feet, but I lost myself.
And he remained there, like one awaiting judgment, like one accepting a bitter harvest. Elsewhere in the kingdom, enemies were rising. Hadad the Edomite was preparing ambushes. Rezon the Syrian was forging alliances. The walls of Israel stood firm, but its spiritual protection had been broken. Solomon no longer fought, no longer commanded, only watched. The wisest man on earth had become a king defeated by his own desires, and the fire that rose was not accepted in heaven. Time did not stop because of the king's fall. While Solomon shut himself inside his chambers, the kingdom moved forward, but not in peace. The borders, once secure, became fragile lines. Hadad, the Edomite descendant, attacked caravans and southern villages. Rezon the Syrian set fire to outposts and camps in the north. Messengers arrived with dust on their faces and shock in their eyes. The palace responded slowly, hesitantly, without conviction. There was no urgency, no fear. The king was no longer king. The people noticed. The assemblies thinned. The Levites murmured. The elders, once reverent, now exchanged glances of doubt. Solomon, once the most heard voice on earth, had become a rare echo within golden walls. Even the scribes no longer recorded every word, for there were no words. The court filled with silence, and silence became habit. Through the palace halls, the king's son walked with haste. Rehoboam, young and arrogant, looked at the throne as one looks at an inheritance, not a sacred burden. He watched his father with veiled disdain, as one who sees weakness instead of glory. Solomon saw him from afar. He did not correct, did not rebuke. He simply observed, knowing the weight of the promise now rested on him. In his final years, Solomon returned to writing. Not proverbs for the wise nor songs for lovers. He wrote for himself, about himself. A testament from a broken soul seeking meaning before the end.
I made for myself gardens and fountains. I acquired servants, riches, women, and power. Everything I desired, I took, and all was vanity.
The scroll filled with confession, not instruction, and the hands that once raised the temple now trembled over lines of repentance. One sunless morning, Solomon walked alone to a dry field outside the city. He sought no answer, offered no sacrifice. He simply stood before the earth, knelt, and said,
Lord, if there is still anything in me that serves you, let it be this confession.
No vision, no thunder, no angel, only the wind. But the king, for the first time in a long time, was not expecting fire. He was hoping for acceptance. Meanwhile, the city prepared for transition. The officials debated policies. The princes forged alliances. No one asked about the king. No one spoke his name. It was as if Solomon had died before his actual death. And so it was that the wisest man on earth, after knowing all that eyes could desire, ended his days with a single certainty. The end of all things is this: fear God. No palace could eternalize that sentence, but heaven, which once fell silent, still heard it. How many of us today seek the shine of gold, yet leave the altar without fire? How many build outward temples while our hearts are divided among many inner altars? The story of Solomon is not just about an ancient king. It is a mirror, reflecting the risk of all who have once heard the voice of God and still chose the silence of their passions. But there is still a way back. There is still redemption. Solomon ended his life with trembling hands and a broken soul, but with a heart turned toward the only place where meaning can be found. And he wrote so that all would know. The end of all things is this: fear God. He bowed late, but he bowed. And that door is still open for all who will listen while there is still time. And if this story touched your spirit, don't keep it to yourself, share it. Leave your like and comment something that moved you in this story, so that our lives, unlike Solomon's, may be remembered not for the fall, but for the faithfulness until the end. And may God bless you.